Hello, my name is Audrey Gordon, and I'd like to welcome you to the 24th day of the Dataverse Advent Calendar. Today, we want to talk about an introduction to Dataverse Security Concepts. Dataverse has a very robust security model, which means you can set security very granularly. So I'm going to look at this video today as a basic introduction to those concepts. And as you grow in your Dataverse experience, you will enrich in these basics with actual usability. There are basically two building blocks, as you can see on the left here, the same as any other software as a service. You're going to have an authentication, and then you're going to have authorization. Right? So authentication lets you in, and just like everything else in the Microsoft stack, this is going to be through Azure Active Directory or AAD. But once you get in, you'll be authorized to do things with data in Dataverse via these different building blocks, such as role-based security, business units with or without Azure Active Directory security groups associated to them, teams, table and record ownership, record sharing, hierarchical and matrix data access structure. So these are all different terms that relate to how Dataverse authorizes people to do things. And so we'll talk a little bit about each one today, and I'll give you plenty of documentation so that you'll be able to follow up on this introduction with some additional detail. Suffice it to say, you're going to have the core basics no matter what you do. You're going to have environment level security, which you can do by optionally attaching a security group to your environment when you create it. This will actually change what people are available in your people pickers when you're working in that environment. The next thing you'll be able to do is record level owning. So you'll be able to assign ownership of records, as well as individuals being able, if they have the right, of course, to share those records. In addition to the record level security, you also have column level security, which means that even a particular column can be secured. And in that case, if that column's in a view and I don't have the right to see the data in that column, I'm going to see a little indicator that says it's locked with some asterisks. That means I can't see anything. Then finally, we have a few options for building security based on your hierarchy at your company. We have two methods of that, which I'm going to leave you to read about because we don't have time to cover these two today. All right, so let's break these core components down a little bit further, starting with record ownership. There are two types of record ownership in Dataverse. Organizationally owned, so the org, every time you build an environment and you add a Dataverse instance to it, it automatically creates an org level business unit. And so you can use that org level to decide, whether I want my records to be owned on an organizational level, or another option we have is to have it owned by user or team. And so whether that be a team or a specific user in the team. And this decision is made at the time you create your tables. And so it can't be changed. So you want to think about it when you're creating tables. So let's give you some decision makers here. For records that are organizationally owned, the only access level choices is either the user can do something or they can't. So there's not a lot of you either can or you can't when it comes to organizationally owned things. And some objects can only be owned by the organization, such as virtual tables. On the other hand, for user and team-owned records, the access level choices for most privileges are tiered organization, business unit and child business unit, or only the user's own records. Again, some objects can only be owned by the user and team, such as activity type tables. We'll talk more about these groupings here in just a few seconds, okay? And then finally, in the case of user owned, the user would only see their own records, okay? So think about these two things when you're thinking about record ownership, because you need to make that decision at the time you create the table. Next, the business unit. Business units work with security roles, which we'll talk about next, to determine the effective security that a user has. Business units define a security boundary. So here's where I want to give you a little bit of a warning. You may have in your head the definition of a business unit because your enterprise has 150 business units, and some of them fall under this org in your business, another one falls under that org in your business. But this is not what this is talking about. This is not talking about your business units. These business units in Dataverse are really just security boundaries. They're saying, how do you want to segment your business via these units, right? And so they are security boundaries that you define, okay? And every Dataverse database has a single root business unit. And you can see that image here. This was created by Dataverse for me. Just because I added a Dataverse database, bam, I got this default business unit. All right. Now, this business unit can be used to give everybody access to the data. Because if you give everybody access to the data, now everybody in that business unit, basically anyone that's added by default, is part of that business unit. Now they would all be able to access that on the level of the permissions that you assigned. However, you can create child business units to help further segment your users and data. Okay, usually that kind of everyone in the same business unit model doesn't always work. All right. So therefore, every user assigned to an environment will belong to a business unit. This is your target. Either they're going to be in the default, or they're going to be in another one that you can create, because you can just hit new and create another child business unit under this one. So imagine this is for an environment that human resources is using to put out their solutions. They have that top level business unit, but then they've decided there's some records that are going to be owned only by managers and other records that are going to be owned only by executives. And so they're saying there's going to be some data that we're going to publish, or we want to encourage managers to publish, that we don't want everybody in the company to have access to. And that's a very typical scenario. And there may also be something similar for executives. Now, what's nice is that these two business units can be shared. In other words, we can allow the executives not only to see the data in their business unit, but to also have any level of access to the manager's data. All right, so they can see both if they want to. Whereas we could say managers only see their own data and maybe the data that's shared with the entire company. So that's what I mean by it's granular. You can set it up the way you need your solutions to work. Now, which business unit that users are associated with will determine which business unit owns the records that the user owns, okay? So when you set up records to be owned by business units, do recognize that, therefore, users who are assigned to those business units, right, their records are going to be owned by that business unit as well. We'll take a minute to go look at this in a few minutes. This is where you find all the security for Dataverse. It's all in the admin center under users and permissions. So it's nicely consolidated together for your convenience. All right, so let's move on. So far we've talked about record ownership, and then we found out that business units own records and that there's a default business unit, but we can further segment to have additional child business units. Now, let's talk about this security role. You'll hear this talked about a lot. So let me kind of make it friendlier for you. Dataverse uses role-based security to group together a collection of privileges. Okay, and I love talking to SharePoint people about this, but if you look, for instance, if you have used SharePoint before, you'll notice that there's that edit, contribute, and then owner group. Those groups that come out by default have a lot of permission levels associated with them. People don't often know this unless they've worked in SharePoint security extensively, but for every group, there are a set of permission levels grouped under that. And you can create your own permissions levels, right? So this is very similar in Dataverse in that we group our collection of privileges into a role-based security group, okay? And then the thing to remember, though, is as you set up these privileges and you give people more than one privilege or more than one security role, then this is the fact here. In Dataverse security, all privilege grants are cumulative with the greatest amount of access prevailing. Okay, so the highest access level prevailing, the broadest amount of access prevailing. So here's the example. This comes directly from our docs, by the way. If you give broad organizational level read access to all contact records, you can't go back after the fact and hide just one record. Okay, now this is kind of like the facts. Let's talk about the details on the right side of this diagram, because it's basically you're going to feel these different level of access as they roll up or roll down. So starting with global, this is where you can access all records in the organization. So that is this organizational, and you'll see these symbols when you start working in Dataverse security, but that solid green is global. And global includes the ones we're going to talk about, deep, local, and basic, okay? Because they roll up into it, all right? Now, next broadest level would be parent business unit plus child business units. So basically, I put my little "my" in brackets, meaning, think of the user. Access all records in my business unit and all subordinate business units. So all child business units under that. And what rolls into this is local and basic. All right. So if you're not global, you might be parent child, or you might be deep, right? Deep means not just your business unit, but all subordinate or all child business units beneath you. Thirdly, you get the idea of the local business unit. All right. So I'm just concerned about stuff in my own business unit. And remember that a business unit is a way of segmenting data. All right. So in that business unit that I am associated with as a user or as a team, I can access all the records in my business unit created by anyone else in my business unit. Okay. And that includes basic user. Basic user is the lowest or the least broad, I will say the least broad level of access, which is very basic, of course, makes sense. And this means access all my records. So everything that I've created, plus any objects that have been shared with me, and plus any objects shared with my team. Now, if I don't have any of these levels of security, then I probably got none, which means that no access is granted. And what you do in Dataverse, and maybe we can take a peek at this if we have time, but even if we don't, there'll be pictures in the document that I'm going to share in the links. Each of the objects in Dataverse allows you to set these level of permissions. All your tables, any object, basically any object in Dataverse that shows up in a table will enable you to set this level of security. Okay, so unbelievable how granular this actually is. All right, so we learned already, we learned about record ownership organization or user and team. We learned about the business unit, which is a way of segmenting data. Okay, it's a boundary. It's a boundary that you can use. Then we talked about security roles, which can be set on any object within the table structure of Dataverse. And now we're going to talk about record level privileges. Okay, so when you get this level of access, you also can be given 8 different record level privileges, which is awesome. We usually hear about the typical CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete. Okay, in Dataverse, you're going to have create, read, write, delete, just like that typical CRUD, but you're also going to have an additional 4. And the big reason why these additional 4 are really important is because of the relationships in Dataverse, right? So Dataverse being a relational database, and I would say really heavy on that, right? That's where its strength is. We need to be able to have the ability to extend those relationships as needed and to support those relationships as needed. So you're going to see 4 different things that you may not recognize. So, and I will actually give you a link to both of these, but these are the most commonly misunderstood: append and append to. So again, because of the relationships, if I need to append something, which means I need to associate the current record that I'm on with another record, right? So I'm on a record right now, and I want to associate it with something else, a photo, a doc, in a different table, right? An activity, etc. I need append rights to create that relationship between this record and that record, right? But then append to is kind of just the opposite end. From that record, if I want to make an association to the current record, I need rights to do that as well. And I'll just, what I like doing is pointing you to that page so that you can read these two, because you'll find that when you read them, they sound almost identical, but I think it has a lot to do with the direction, which direction you're coming from. Are you coming from adding to the current record, or just making a connection from a thing that has been added back? Okay. And then there's assign, and this one is also very often misunderstood, because when we see this in other cases, assign means like assign a task. Hey, I'm going to give you this task to do. It's been assigned to you. It's not that. Okay. So take that thought out of your head. It's not that. This is about assigning ownership. Okay. Ownership. So basically in Dataverse, you will sometimes see an assign to field. That's the one you were thinking about before. But when you see assign like that, alone by itself, or in a record level privilege, please recognize that that is a way to assign ownership. So where assign comes in handy is if I need to assign ownership to another user. For instance, I own this record, and for some reason there was a reorg or something, and there's a new person that needs to own that record. I can assign that record to another person, and now they own it. Okay? And then finally there's share, and this is fairly typical when we think of sharing. The key thing to remember here is when you have a sharing access, right? You can give access to a record to another user, but in this case, you keep your own access. Okay? So it's you adding that other person, not delegating to that other person. Okay? And so these are your record level privileges. So you can see just how granular it gets when you're thinking about Dataverse security. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is column level security before we go take a peek. Column level security is where you actually specify that this particular column is restricted, okay? This particular column. And you actually will see that in the advanced settings of each column that you make. And this one you can turn on at any time, okay? So enable column security. When you click that box, the moment you click that box, because no one else has been given access, only the system administrator can access the values in that column. Okay, so it's very important when you click it that you recognize you're making an instant impact. The moment you click that, no one else can see the data in that column. All right, if you're a system admin when you do this, keep this in mind. You just locked everybody out of that column. So it's very important to go into the settings and set up your column security profiles. And that is basically in the settings of the environment. You create a profile and you basically decide whether they can read, update, or create in that column. So is it just a column that they can read? Is it a column that they can change? And is it a column they can create the first value, right, in a record, right? So you have, again, granular security even on that column level. And you can assign this permission on a team level or a user level. I do think the best practice here is to use your teams versus explicitly adding users, but you have the option to do both. Every column that you mark enable column security will fall under the same user experience or settings page. And so even when you create a new security profile, you will see all the columns that have been marked for column level security. And then you can, for each one, set up which team can do what with that column. If someone does not have access to this column and they're looking at a view that includes that column, they will see a little lock and some asterisk symbols, which means that you don't have the right to see this data. What else did I want to tell you? Column level security is a mute issue if the person doesn't have access to the record. So if they don't have access to the record, so you should seek to do record level security firstly, and then only when necessary, bring it down to the column level. Okay, so are we ready to look at all this? Let's go peek at it in Power Apps. All right, so here I am in Power Apps. The first thing I want to show you is that one point about when you create a table is your time to decide whether or not the table is organization or user or team. And that happens at the moment you create the new table and cannot be changed afterward. So think about what you're planning to do, right? Remember that organizational level objects, or you can or you can't. There's not a lot of granularity there, right? So if you want to share with everybody and you don't really, or you want to either share or don't share, you don't want a lot of that granular stuff in the middle, organization might be a good thing. But otherwise, user and team is common for most tables. It gives you the most flexibility. Now, I will point out, if you choose activity table, right, activity, it will not let you select organization, because activities, which have actual start times, actual end times, and durations, they're more task-centric. They need a user or a team. We don't want the whole organization owning a particular task or activity. So that's always going to be user or team. The other thing is, if you create a virtual table, that will also be forced as an organizational object, okay? You cannot do user and team for virtual tables at this time. Today is December 21st, 2022. All right? Now, where do we find all this security stuff? Is we start in the admin center. Security is configured on an environment level, okay? You don't configure security on a tenant level. You configure it on an environment level. However, you can share it across environments by using solutions. In solutions, you can include security roles as a solution object, or you can create a Power Automate flow, which will create your teams for you in Dataverse. So that's why it's important to know what's solution aware and what isn't, because sharing security concepts will take place through your solution, and that is the only way you're going to be able to do that, through a solution. All right, so here we're going to go and we're going to look at somebody's, does it matter who? Let's look at this settings here. And these are your admin settings that you're going to be playing around with very often. Expect yourself to be in here every now and then. But the key area for security is this area called users and permissions. And basically everything you need for security is falling somewhere in here. And that's why it was important for me to pick the environment first, because security is on an environment level. Okay, so make sure you do that. I'm going to send you some documentations in the links below that will kind of go over all of these concepts, including the ones I covered today. But I do want to point out another important feature setting. So in the product area, if you go to features, there is a feature you may want to turn on related to security. And I'll just roll down to that. And that's this one, record ownership across business units. And this is back to where I was saying that HR environment had some stuff for managers and some stuff for executives, but they wanted the executives to see not only their own, but also the managers. And so in that case, they're going to allow record ownership across business units. And they'll usually leverage Azure Active Directory security groups for that as well. So you can manage the access through a security group rather than continuously playing around with Dataverse security. Once you associate an AAD security group with a team in a business unit, you can actually revise it directly from the Azure portal if that's where you're comfortable. Okay, so that is all I wanted to cover in the introduction to Dataverse Security Concept. Lots of links in the description, and I look forward to talking to you. Unbelievably, tomorrow is the last day. I can't believe how time just flies when you're having fun, right? So tomorrow we're going to talk about the art of the possible in Dataverse. So I look forward to celebrating that final day with you tomorrow, and happy holidays.